Tonight, you tuck your kids into bed, or maybe just glance at a photo of family sleeping safely under one roof. You assume that a locked door and a quiet street mean nothing bad can happen there. In June of 1912, a family in a small Iowa town believed exactly the same thing. By morning, all 8 of them were dead, and the case would go unsolved for more than 100 years. The town was Villisca, Iowa. Population, barely 2,000. The kind of place where everyone recognized everyone else's footsteps on the porch. On the night of June 9th, the Moore family came home from a church service. Josiah Moore, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. 2 neighborhood sisters, Ina and Lena Stillinger, had asked to sleep over that night, the way children do. Sarah said yes without a second thought. By sunrise, 8 people would be dead inside that house, and not one of them would wake up. A neighbor noticed the silence first. No children playing in the yard. No chores being done. She called Josiah's brother, who arrived with a spare key. What he found defied logic. Every victim had been killed with an axe. One that belonged to the family, found leaning against a wall inside the house. Nothing had been stolen. There was no sign the doors had been forced. Whoever did this had either been let in or had never left in the first place. Here's where the case turns from horrifying into something stranger. The killer didn't rush. He covered the faces of the victims with clothing. He draped sheets over every mirror in the house. He ate food from the icebox and washed his hands in a bowl of water before walking out the front door, locking it behind him. Ask yourself, why cover a mirror in a house full of bodies? No investigator in 1912 could answer that. No investigator today can either. The town descended into panic. Grand juries convened. Suspects were arrested, released, and arrested again. One of the strangest figures in the whole case was a traveling minister named George Kelly, who had preached in Villisca the day before the murders and left town early the next morning, hours before the bodies were found. Kelly became obsessed with the case afterward, writing letters to investigators and even to the victim's family. He eventually confessed to the killings in court. Then he recanted, claiming the confession had been forced out of him. The jury didn't believe either version enough to convict. Other names surfaced. Frank Jones, a state senator and Josiah Moore's former business rival, was suspected of orchestrating the murders out of professional jealousy, though no evidence ever tied him to the scene. A man known as William Mansfield, sometimes nicknamed by the press for his troubled past, was tried years later and acquitted after producing an alibi placing him in another state entirely. Every lead dissolved the same way. Close enough to suspect. Never close enough to prove. But here's the detail that turns Villisca from a single town's tragedy into something far bigger. 9 months before the Moore family was killed, a family in Colorado Springs, Colorado, was murdered in almost the exact same way. Same weapon, same lack of forced entry. 2 more axe murders followed in Ellsworth and Paula, Kansas. Investigators at the time noted the resemblance, but in 1912 there was no shared database, no coordinated task force between states. A murder in Kansas simply didn't reach a sheriff's desk in Iowa. Villisca wasn't an isolated nightmare. It was one entry in a pattern nobody at the time had the tools to see. That pattern sat mostly forgotten for decades, until a modern researcher took a second look. Iowa historian Edgar Epperly spent years combing through the Villisca case, cataloging testimony, letters, and evidence that had scattered across courthouses and private collections. Separately, the writer Bill James, working with his daughter Rachel McCarthy James, laid Villisca side by side with more than a dozen similar axe murders stretching from Texas to Illinois. Their research, published in a book called The Man from the Train, argued these weren't a dozen unconnected horrors. They were, quite possibly, the work of one person, traveling by rail from town to town for over a decade, undetected. Why would someone do this without ever taking money, without ever leaving a name, without any apparent motive beyond the act itself? Forensic psychologists who study cases like this point to something beyond greed or revenge, a need for total control, one so complete it extends even to hiding a victim's own reflection. The mirrors, the covered faces, the calm and unhurried movement through the house, all of it points toward someone who wasn't out of control in that moment. He was, disturbingly, entirely in control. This is where Villisca stops being just a puzzle and starts feeling like a mirror held up to the world that let it happen. Because the very thing that made this town feel safe, its distance from other towns, its trust that this kind of horror belonged elsewhere, was the exact condition that allowed it to happen again and again, without anyone connecting the dots. Safety, in this story, was built almost entirely out of not knowing. Think about how differently this case would unfold today. A single unusual death now gets logged into national databases within days. A detective in Iowa can cross-reference a crime scene against patterns in Colorado with a few keystrokes. DNA evidence, if any had survived, could sit waiting for decades until the technology caught up to identify it. And yet, even with all of that modern capability, the Villisca case remains formally unsolved. No one was ever convicted. The house still stands today, restored to its 1912 condition, open for tours, its walls holding onto a silence that has never been fully explained.